One of the most common questions at the museum or at any presentation is why weren't there any children of color placed out as orphan train riders? The pictures that have survived from the era play into this. There are rarely children of color pictured. There were riders of color, just fewer. This topic is important to better understand the entire history of the orphan train movement. More knowledge on how equality and equity worked during the movement allows better understanding of equality and equity in today's foster care system. I begin any talk on the orphan train with the story of immigration. Immigration is not to blame for the orphan train movement. The growth of New York and other East Coast cities that were ill-prepared for their new arrivals, the lacking infrastructure of the cities, minimal family and child welfare organizations, unsafe and unregulated living and working environments led to loss, extreme poverty, and the breakdown of families. This chart illustrates the influx of immigrants, the major reasons for coming, and the major sending regions. Between 1854 and 1896, the Children's Aid Society gave detailed statistics on the nationalities of children placed out, as well as what state or country they went to, their parentage, or if any of their parents were living, and the number of children sent out each month. From these statistics, we were able to find that at least 47 nationalities were placed out within the first 40 years of the Children's Aid Society Placing Out program. We took this data and compared it to the immigration demographics of the same time periods, and did find parallels within the data. Larger groups of immigrants, like the Irish and the German, lined up with the number of Irish and German children placed out. But there were others, like the Scandinavians, that due to their settlement patterns, economic status, and demographic categorization, did not appear in large numbers in the children placed out. These are the nationalities of riders placed out. I have underlined those considered children of color. There will be ones that surprise you, like Finnish. I will explain that in a second. But what is incredible is that 5 continents are represented. It just proves that we are a nation of immigrants and the orphan train was no different. And while new immigrant children represent a large number of orphan train riders, over 50% were American-born. To better understand why some immigrant children became part of the child welfare system, we have to understand why their families came to America. The most common type of immigration I remember learning about in school surrounded people coming to America for better opportunities. Streets paved with gold and the American dream. While we know now that most streets in New York weren't paved, let alone gold, the majority of these people don't stay in cities. Scandinavian, British, German, and the first wave of Hungarian immigrants are coming for better economic circumstances, but are set apart from others of the same group because of their existing economic status before coming over. They are well off enough to immigrate to not just the port of entry, but to go on to form and join communities in rural areas. Whereas others in this group, second-wave Hungarians who come at the turn of the century and Russians who come between 1881 and 1914, are poorer and settle in cities and mining communities in Pennsylvania. This group also includes a portion of Chinese immigrants who came for a better opportunity, but due to their port of entry, the majority of Chinese and other Asian immigrants settle on the West Coast. There are also many immigrants who come to the United States during this era to work for a short period of time before returning home to purchase land or just improve their economic circumstances overall in their home country. There is a good percentage of immigrants who come to work with the intention of returning that eventually stay in the States as well. Italians are one of these groups. They immigrate in waves, the first being a small group after the American Revolution of skilled artisans from northern Italy. The second came in the second half of the 1800s and included skilled workers and entertainers. The third wave was really the mass migration of Italians, with the first wave consisting mostly of young single men intent on working, saving, and returning to Italy. Some made multiple trips and were labeled birds of passage. It was only in the 1900s that Italian women and families began coming to America to settle. Other groups who came and went during this era include Romanians, who came following persecution, forced assimilation, and economic depression. They worked until they had earned enough money to purchase land back in Romania. Greek immigrants, while small in number during this time, followed a similar pattern, but only 30% of those who came returned to Greece. Some returned not only to buy land, but to fight in the Balkan Wars. There are 2 major groups who come due to religious persecution between 1850 and 1920. The first were Jewish immigrants coming from Russia. About 1.5 million came between 1881 to 1914. Most would settle in urban cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Rochester, New York. The other group are Jewish, Armenian, and other Turkish minorities from the Ottoman Empire. They fall under our next category of immigrants who came due to political conflict or refugees as well. However, the Muslim Turkish immigrants, who were the majority in the Ottoman Empire, faced religious persecution once immigrating to the U.S. Between 1894 to 1897, the Hamidian massacres were carried out by the Ottoman Empire. The target of the massacre were the minorities of the nation, Assyrians, Albanians, and Armenians, who are the oldest group of Christians in the Middle East. The estimated death toll is between 200,000 and 400,000. The Near East Foundation and wealthy Americans John D. Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundation would open their coffers and churches would rush to help. The massacre would call Clara Barton to take the first Red Cross teams outside the United States to provide relief. Many were brought out of the country as refugees. Many Armenians would immigrate to the United States to escape the genocide carried out by the Ottoman Empire that began with the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s. Between 1890 to 1914, approximately 64,000 Armenians would find refuge in America, most settling in the Northeast and California. This does not include those that would have come after the Armenian genocide between 1915 to 1923. Also in this category of immigration are the Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine that lasted between 1846 to 1856 and killed approximately 1 million people. The ones who immigrate came with little and were unable to move out of their arrival cities. Between 1820 to 1930, about 4.5 million Irish immigrants came to America. The potato famine refugees make up half of that number. Ireland still has never fully returned their population before the famine. In 1841, the population was 8.2 million. In 2019, it was 4.9 million. Next, we must talk about forced migration. Between 1600 to 1900, an estimated 12 million to 12.8 million Africans were abducted and transported across the Atlantic. After federal emancipation, there are a first and second Great Migration between 1910 and 1970, with over 6 million Black Americans moving first to the North and Midwest, and the second migration to the West. The Black Orphan Train Riders we see are before these migrations. They would be the children of freed Black Americans from the North, or exodusters. Exodusters left the South after the Civil War in the 1870s. There was a movement of about 40,000 Black Americans to the Midwest, and as we know here in Kansas, they go on to found exoduster communities like Nicodemus. Included in forced migration are large sects of Chinese immigrants who are compelled to leave China as contract laborers. Black Orphan Train Riders also come out of existing Black communities in New York City before and after the Civil War. It was actually a visitor to the complex that taught me about Seneca Village. Seneca Village was a community begun in 1825, 2 years before the full emancipation of slavery in New York State. A gentleman named Andrew William was the first to purchase 3 plots from John and Elizabeth Whitehead for $125. 24 more plots would be sold to members of the AME Church, or the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which was the wealthiest Black church in the country. The community would become very successful. The majority of the population was Black, but there were also Native Americans and German, English, and Irish immigrants living, working, and worshiping together. It is also thought to have had ties to the Underground Railroad, with abolitionist Albert Lyons owning property and living in the community. In 1857, the New York State Legislature voted to use eminent domain to acquire land for Central Park. Seneca Village was removed in order to make room for the park. In 2011, archaeological work began to finally document and preserve Seneca Village. Other Black communities were Newtown in Queens, and communities in the neighborhoods of the Tenderloin, San Juan Hill, Monetta Lane in Greenwich Village, and Hell's Kitchen. There are plenty of remarks about orphan train organizations targeting immigrants and taking their children. I have not found direct evidence of this, but modern-day demographics showcase the disproportionate number of impoverished immigrant and single-parent homes represented in the foster care system, so those remarks are not surprising. While organizations like the Children's Aid Society offered a place to all children regardless of race, nationality, religion, age, gender, or legitimacy, they were not free of prejudicial or racist thinking. In an excerpt from the 1892 annual report of the Children's Aid Society, they state, "There is no work more important to the future of the city of New York than that of educating and training the children of the ignorant and helpless foreigners who crowd into the tenements in the Russian, Polish, Bohemian, Hungarian, and Italian quarters of our city. They must be taught our language, they must be trained to be clean, obedient to authority, industrious, and truthful, and must be instructed in the elements of an English education. The ignorance, dirt, and poverty of thousands of these children prevent their attendance at the public schools of the city. And but for our industrial schools and others similar, they would be left neglected." While the Children's Aid Society and New York Juvenile Asylum were ahead of the pack, the majority of orphanages were incredibly specific on who they chose to help. Slavery was only fully abolished in New York in 1827. And orphaned black children were denied aid at orphanages and were often left to live in jails or be controlled by men who used them as beggars and chimney sweeps. This led to the need of orphanages dedicated to the care of children of color. The first was the Colored Orphan Asylum in Manhattan, founded in 1836. The Brooklyn Howard Colored Orphan Asylum opened in 1866 under the name Home for Freed Children and Others. The original Colored Orphan Asylum was burned down deliberately during the draft riots of 1863 in New York, but thankfully was rebuilt on 143rd Street in the Bronx. Due to prejudice in the public school system, children of color entered orphanages simply because they needed an education, and the orphanage was the only place to provide it. They had families and homes, but not the same right to public education. One of the most striking differences between these two institutions is who led and staffed them. The Colored Orphan Asylum was run by an all-white female board and nearly all-white staff, while the Brooklyn Howard Colored Orphan Asylum was run by an all-black board and nearly all-black staff. While the intent of both were to help children of color, and they did, the language used to describe the children differs. While both tend to use the term scholar in lieu of inmate to describe a child's place within the organization, the Colored Orphan Asylum's approach to care for children of color differs due to inherent racism. In the 1878 annual report of the Association for the Benefit of Colored People, the organization behind the Colored Orphan Asylum, they state, "There are peculiarities in the constitution of the colored people which are difficult to contend with. While as a race they are gentle and amenable to authority, they are especially deficient in the power of vigorous independent thought and action. The entail is hereditary servitude. It requires a strong and persistent training to awaken the dormant energies, stimulate the habit of self-assertion, and develop the large possibilities of the race." Unquote. This thought would permeate how children and riders of color were cared for, watched over after placement, and educated. It is not pleasant to think about, but it is so important to recognize and understand so it does not permeate the current system or our own actions. While this presentation will focus on the placing out of riders of color by the Children's Aid Society, we do find that the New York Foundling Hospital took in children of color. We just don't find them placing them out in homes, because they were placing them in other institutions. In 2014, we were contacted by the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, Maryland. They have records, which they shared with us, of black female children being sent from the Foundling to the Oblate Sisters. The sisters provided education and training like other orphanages. However, they were not focused on placing the children out via orphan trains, but raising the girls until they aged out. We then located these huge articles promoting and detailing the Foundling's work, where they state that, quote, "colored children are taken care of by colored women until they reach the required age, when the girls go to a home in Baltimore and the boys to Nebraska, where they are educated to trades." While we have looked in Nebraska for the boys being sent out by the Foundling, we suspect they actually went to Leavenworth, Kansas, where the Oblate Sisters of Providence of Baltimore had a mission and ran the Guardian Angel Home Orphanage. We have found black children from New York in their censuses and will continue to dig into the history. We covered before that the reason people immigrate plays into if their children were placed out via orphan trains. While the Children's Aid Society placed out children of all colors, we find that groups like the Finnish are underrepresented. When we dug into Finnish immigration history, we discovered the potential reason that not many Finnish were immigrating to the United States. If we take a look at these pictures, the woman on the left is a Finnish immigrant at Ellis Island. The child, Thomas, was an Armenian refugee. In 1900, only one of these individuals would be considered white. Thomas. When Armenian refugees were brought to America, their Christianity played a role in their label. In America during the Chinese Exclusion Act that began in 1882 and lasted until 1943, only people deemed white or black could be citizens of the United States. And although Armenians absolutely faced racism and prejudice due to their skin color, they were considered white under the law. The Finnish were considered Asian, and thus excluded from citizenship until a court case in 1908 in Minnesota decided they had evolved enough to be considered white. We will begin the stories of riders of color with Thomas's. He, his mother, and sister were rescued by the Red Cross during the Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1897. Sadly, Thomas's father had been shot and killed by the Ottoman forces. Thomas, born July 26, 1890, would have only been 4 years old when the massacre began. Life as a single parent and refugee would not have been easy, and Thomas's mother placed him in the Brace Memorial Farm School under the auspices of the Children's Aid Society. The superintendents were Mr. and Mrs. Windle, or as he was lovingly known, Pop Windle. At 9 years old, Thomas was placed out in Williamsburg, Iowa by Agents Clark and Trott. Agent Clark placed the little boy with John Wallace and his family. John Wallace was unmarried and lived with his mother, 2 sisters, a cousin Mamie, and 1 farmhand. Thomas was well treated by the family, and he took the Wallace family name and became Thomas de Morgian Wallace. It is clear from Agent Clark's writings that he held a special fondness for Thomas. He wrote, quote, "He was made fun of by American children, but soon outstripped them all in school, and took first prize in an oratory entitled, quote, 'My Native Land,' unquote, and second in carpentry. On June 8, 1911, he graduated with high honor from high school," unquote. Thomas's mother and sister had moved to Fresno, California before Thomas's graduation. While traveling across the country, they made a stop into Iowa to visit Thomas and the Wallace family. Thomas thrived in Iowa, and Agent Clark described him as such, quote, "His work on the farm gave him muscle, and the quietness and home-like atmosphere of the farm life was his making," unquote. Following graduation, Thomas would reunite with his mother and sister in Reedley, California, just outside Fresno, which was home to a large Armenian population. He would attend the University of California in Berkeley and graduated with a law degree in May 1916. Although the de Morgian family was safe in America, the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923 would affect the family and the communities of Armenian Americans throughout the United States. The genocide would claim the lives of 1.5 million Armenians at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Thomas was still in university at the beginning of the events and wrote a powerful article titled, quote, "Tribes are slaughtered, Armenian horrors told, aid is asked for victims," unquote. It was published in the Oakland Tribune on October 22, 1916. In the article, Thomas details the atrocities he witnessed at the age of 6. The buildings turned to ash, and the family and friends lost. He asked for aid for the Armenians suffering at the hands of the German-backed Ottoman Empire. He asked for America to intercede, or at the very least provide supplies to the sick and starving. Soon after the writing of his article, America would enter World War I, and Thomas would proudly serve in the American troops. Terrifyingly, only 16 years after the end of the Armenian genocide, Adolf Hitler would cite the massacre in a speech in 1939. Hitler openly spoke of his plan to murder, quote, "all men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language," unquote. He justified his plan by stating that historians remember Genghis Khan, not the millions he killed, but for the civilization he built. He surmised history would remember him in the same way because, quote, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians," unquote. By 1930, Thomas had returned to the East Coast and was working as a clothing salesman in New Jersey. He and his wife Mary had just welcomed their second son, Thomas Jr., and had a 1-year-old son named Wendell, named after the couple who looked after him on the Brace Farm School in New York. While traveling to the West Coast on vacation, Thomas and his family made a stop in Williamsburg, Iowa to say hello to the family who had raised him, the Wallaces. The local newspaper, the Williamsburg Shopper, reported on the happy reunion and boasted about Thomas's achievements. Thomas was now an insurance agent for the Social Security Office. Thomas Demorgian Wallace passed away on August 9, 1950, at 60 years old. He left behind his wife and 2 sons. Before passing, he wrote an article for the Courier News in Bridgewater, New Jersey in 1947 titled, quote, "Enlightened Citizens." To become enlightened citizens is the most important, the most urgent goal for all of us. To become so is the great opportunity, particularly to those of us who are fortunate enough to be living in the good old United States of America. We must engage in activities that are genuinely beneficial to our own age and generation. We must become an essential part and parcel of the community and nation in which we live. Let us unite ourselves for all ages with this far-flung fortress and mightiest of republics, with the only faithful leader of world unity and of abounding freedom. In becoming enlightened, united citizens of America, we need bow our heads to none but God." Unquote. Thomas would not be the only Armenian placed out by the Children's Aid Society via orphan trains. Bahram Shibanian was an Armenian who was born in 1888 in Turkey. Bahram immigrated to New York City in 1909 around the age of 21. But the Children's Aid Society reported Bahram as a 17-year-old orphan when he came to the Brace Memorial Farm School. While he was not placed out in a western state, he was still placed out on a farm in western upstate New York and considered an orphan train rider. In a 1919 letter to the Children's Aid Society, Bahram detailed his life after placement. In 1915, he had moved on from farming and moved to New Haven, Connecticut to pursue a degree at Yale University. He found himself without the sufficient funds, so he began working at the Geometric Tool Company in Westville, Connecticut as an automatic screw machine and lathe operator. He was still there when in 1917, the U.S. entered World War I. He entered the Army one morning in June of 1917 when he saw an Army team headed to Yale Field. He hopped on board, went to the recruiting officer, was examined, and entered the service the same day. 2 months of training later, he and his unit were sent to France. He fought through multiple battles, and after the armistice was signed, volunteered to stay and work as a liaison between the French police and the American military police. Bahram signed off his letter to the Children's Aid Society by saying, quote, "I thank you again and again for your kind consideration toward me, and please, sir, accept my hearty appreciation." Unquote. Only a year later, Bahram married Puris Dove Hamparzumian and continued his work as a machinist upon returning from Europe. In 1925, Bahram changed his name to Victor K. Shepard. Together, Victor and Puris had 3 daughters and a son. Sadly, Puris passed away in 1935 at only 34 years old. After the loss of Puris, the family moved to California. Victor remarried twice and was married to Harriet McPherson when he passed in 1949 at 61 years old in Glendale, California. Dicker Tumayan was born in Constantinople, Turkey around 1868. We found him through a post-placement article. In August 1883, at the age of 15, he immigrated to the United States, likely alone. He quickly found his way to the Children's Aid Society because he was placed out west only a month later. Dickern, along with 14 other boys and 2 families, arrived in Seneca, Kansas on the 7th of September, 1883. Dickern was initially placed with Tim McLaughlin in Centralia. While he was no longer in the McLaughlin home by 1885, he would have been 17 and out of school by this time. Through his passport application in 1888, we find he was likely moved by the Children's Aid Society or went on his own accord to Illinois in 1883. In 1888, he was a student in Chicago and connected to his naturalization witness, Leonard Lower, a podiatrist. Although the Armenian writers we have been able to find came during or due to the Hamidiya massacres, I suspect we will find even more writers coming due to World War I and the Armenian genocide that followed the war. We discovered Ralph Pagan Ortiz in the 1917 Children's Aid Society annual report. The CAS provided a brief biography stating, quote, "Ralph came from Puerto Rico in 1914. He was placed in Texas from our farm school in 1917 when 17 years old," unquote. The letter Ralph wrote in 1917 to the Children's Aid Society came from College Station, Texas, where he was a student. In the letter, Ralph details how he came to the United States and ultimately to Texas. Quote, "When I landed in New York, I had $8.25 left. I tried to get work but failed on account of my language, so I started the life of a tramp." Here I made things that are not to be told. My conscience began to work upon me, and I decided to quit this life. I called on the Children's Aid Society, and Miss Baxter sent me to the Newsboys Lodging House downtown. I didn't like that place, so I went back and asked to be sent to Valhalla. Here I stayed 4 or 5 weeks, and on the 24th of September 1914 started for Texas with 2 companions from the school. I started for Hereford and was taken to R.H. Norton's house by his daughters, who were waiting for me at the station. At once I started work at $10 per month. As I happened to meet and live in the house of a religious gentleman and 3 good-looking daughters, I decided to forget my black life in New York and started to be a gentleman. I began to get acquainted and make friends at once, and decided to go in society, unquote. After Mr. Norton traded his farm for town flats in Kansas City, Ralph began working for a widow, Mrs. M.L. Waller, on the same farm, but she paid $30 a month. Ralph was an avid reader who loved to learn, and even though he had a steady job and a good life in society, he chose to go back to school less than a year after his placement. He enrolled in a 2-year course in agriculture. He left Hereford with $150. Tuition cost him $124.05. The remainder of his money bought his books, and with $5 he bought a bunch of toiletries and candy. He then proceeded to sell the candy and toiletries to his fellow students to make money for his other expenses. Ralph went on to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Texas A&M Extension Office. Ralph's World War I draft card lets us know that he was born in Sabana Grande, Puerto Rico, and because of the Jones Act of 1917 extending citizenship to Puerto Ricans, he was officially a citizen of the United States. Alexander Smith was placed out in Clyde, Kansas in 1884 at 14 years old. He was placed with the Loveland family, a white family. After searching and searching, our head researcher was unable to find any information on Alexander, but we do know he was not in Clyde by 1885. The next few cases will showcase just how difficult researching writers of color can be. Following the placement of 18 children by the Children's Aid Society in 1890 in Hebron, Nebraska, the local newspaper printed an accounting of the event, or what we call a post-placement article. Like normal, the names, ages, and families taking children were included. However, one child was only listed by, quote, the colored boy, unquote. He went to the home of a wealthy, widowed banker who had 1 son. We are continuing to search for his name. He was not in the home by 1900. Charles and J.A. were placed out at 13 and 12 years old by the Children's Aid Society in Holton, Kansas in 1886. We do not know what happened to J.A. yet, but we know why Charles's initial placement did not work. Less than 4 months after the placement, the local committee reconvened due to abuse suffered by Charles at the hands of his foster family, the Dickinsons. Both local newspapers reported the story, but only one placed blame on the child. Charles had been forced into a cornfield in the early daylight hours of the winter to husk corn all day. His hands and feet were frozen. He would lose 2 or 3 toes on one foot, 1 on the other foot, and at least 1 or 2 fingertips. The committee moved the child to the infirmary at the Poor Farm to be cared for until his New York agent came to collect him. The first child of color I found placed with a family of color was Elmer Williams in Olathe, Kansas in 1896. This was the Children's Aid Society's second train to Olathe, the first being 16 years prior in 1880. One of the local committee members also served as a chairman for the 1880 Placing Out Committee, Mr. N.V. Parker. In 1896, the placement had 10 children. Elmer was the only child of color. He is placed with a black family from Osawatomie, Kansas. Elmer was with Henry and Susan Kern in 1900 at 16 years old and listed as a servant. While he is out of the home in 1910, he is back with the couple in 1915 when he is 30, working as a farm laborer. Frederick Johnson was placed out in 1896 in Oswego, Kansas at 13 years old. He was placed in the home of P.H. and Matilda Smiley. He is the second black child I found placed in a black home. P.H. or Henry was a gardener, and in 1900, Frederick is 16 and listed as a day laborer, likely working alongside Mr. Smiley. Frederick had moved on by 1910, but stayed in Oswego and was working as a painter. In 1918, Frederick's World War I draft card reported he was working as a porter at the House of Lords, a famed saloon, brothel, and gambling house in Joplin, Missouri, but living in Oswego. In the 1920 census, Frederick is listed as working as a housekeeper, but it is unclear if he is still with the House of Lords. The saloon was raided in 1922 and shut down. We are still looking for Frederick in the 1930 census. McCune Lear Addison, or Samuel Addison, was placed out by the Children's Aid Society in 1877 at 8 years old. He was taken in by Herman and Mattie Shearholes. Herman had immigrated to the United States from Prussia as a teenager and at 19 enlisted in the Union Army. After his service, he relocated to Alamaki County, Iowa, where he owned and operated a farm and worked as a grocer. He and his wife Elizabeth married in 1875. Only 2 years later, Samuel would join the couple and their 19-year-old niece Lottie, who was living with them. In the 1880 census, McCune is listed as Samuel Addison and the adopted son of the couple. This is the first black child I find listed as adopted by a white family. In 1892, McCune wrote a letter to the Children's Aid Society to inform them of his new life. The letter is titled, quote, "A Young Dentist." Mr. L.W. Holst, Dear Sir, yours of the 8th instance received through my guardian Mr. H. Sherholtz, desiring I believe to ascertain my welfare and whereabouts, and in reply would say that I have left Mr. Sherholtz's paternal roof and have drifted to this great metropolis in quest of what many here never find, viz., as in namely, a fortune. I have chosen the profession of dentistry as my means of obtaining the coveted fortune, and will have completed in March 1892. Although quite busy when I received your letter, I looked back a few years and brought to memory my condition of destitution and privation and your kind rescue, and I said to myself, quote, "Through certainty is a praiseworthy and Christian work," unquote. And I chose a prompt and warm reply as my heartfelt appreciation of your kindness, and then to think that hundreds of young men today can voice me in that sentiment makes the duty of response the more urgent. And I trust the brevity of this letter will not detract from my praises of your indeed benevolent institution. Thanking you kindly for your consideration of me after my silence of so many years, I remain, sir, yours very truly, McCune Lear Addison, number 533 State Street, Chicago, Illinois. Formerly with Mr. H. Sherholtz, Lansing, Iowa. Clifford and William were two black teens placed out by the New York Juvenile Asylum on July 22, 1918. They were living in New York at the Juvenile Asylum in Dobbs Ferry and were placed out through the partnership between the asylum and the Children's Aid Society. We do not know where the boys were sent to yet, but we suspect that they were placed within New York State or a nearby state. We have yet to find a record of William Minor, but we were able to find Clifford. Clifford was born in Virginia and was placed in the New York Juvenile Asylum by 1915. According to his record, he had been living in New Rochelle, New York. When he was placed out, he was 16. By 1920, Clifford is potentially living in two different places. The first census he appears in is mid-January in Fayetteville, West Virginia, with his aunt. As the Children's Aid Society did return children to their family, this could have been his actual placement. Or he was 16 years old when he was placed out. He likely would have stayed less than 2 years and could have reunited with his aunt later on. The second 1920 census Clifford appears in is in early March in Covington, Virginia, which is only 80 miles from his aunt's home in West Virginia. He was working as a butler for the Hammond family. By 1930, Clifford had returned to New York and worked at a compressed air factory. He married his first wife Eliza in 1930. Together they had 2 children, Gloria and Raymond. The couple divorced in 1939. Eliza cited desertion as the cause. In 1939, Clifford remarried to Lavinia Colburn, a nurse. In 1942, when Clifford registered for the World War II draft, we discovered that Clifford is already working for the U.S. Navy. We are still looking into if he was enlisted or working as a civilian at Pearl Harbor Naval Base. Clifford and Lavinia relocated to Maryland after the war, and the couple both passed in 1970, only months apart. The 1882 Worthington, Minnesota placement by the Children's Aid Society is one of my favorites to talk about during presentations because it has everything. The local committee was excellent with prominent businessmen, town founders, veterans, the sheriff, and a U.S. Army engineer. There are 2 black riders and an Italian rider with my favorite name of Michael Angelo Mazzucca. The two black riders on the train were Charles DeGraff and Henry Webb. And with this placement, we finally found a connection between the Colored Orphan Asylum and the Children's Aid Society. Both boys were in the Colored Orphan Asylum in 1880. The boys would be placed together in the home of Daniel Schell, who was on the local placing out committee and who also owned the local Worthington Hotel. The boys were still at the hotel in 1885, likely taken in to work for the hotel. We find that children of color placed out during the orphan train movement were more likely to go to work younger and less likely to be treated as a member of the family. As was mentioned in the beginning, whiteness has not always been what we view it as today, and the Worthington placement shows this. We tracked many children because they were singled out as the other in placing reports. We find reports of children of color identified in local newspapers, whether they were black, Bohemian, Italian, Turkish, or a number of other nationalities. While there are times when children are singled out for their immigrant status, regardless of race, it is always addressed if the child is considered a person of color. That is why we tell the stories of two sets of Italian sisters and a little boy of Bohemian descent. Carmen De Niro was born in 1890 and was the first child H.D. Clark placed out from the Children's Aid Society when he began his work as a placing agent in 1898. Carmen and her sister Jessie had been wards of the New York Infant Asylum before being transferred to the care of the Children's Aid Society. Jessie De Niro was born in 1889 and was placed first in Brockford, Iowa in 1895 at 6 years old. Over the next 4 years, she would be placed in 5 different homes. Carmen was placed in Dodge Center, Minnesota at 8 years old. She was placed with Mrs. S. of the city. After only 3 months, Mrs. S. requested Carmen be removed from the home, seeing as she had no musical talent, as Mrs. S. assumed all Italians had by inheritance. Agent Clark moved Carmen to the home of Mr. and Mrs. A.N. Langworthy, a family friend. In 1899, H.D. Clark received word that he would need to move Jessie De Niro again. He brought the young girl home to Dodge Center, and his wife took Jessie to A.N. Langworthy's home, reuniting the sisters after 4 years of no contact. Jessie fit right in with the family. In 1912, Jessie wrote a letter to the Children's Aid Society that appeared in their annual report. She wrote, quote, "Dear Sir, I received your letter many months ago, and I have remembered to write to you, and have saved one of my pictures for you. I am now teaching school and enjoy the work. I may continue teaching next year, although I am anxious to study elocution, which I may if all goes well. I also am enjoying my home, for Mr. and Mrs. L. have certainly done all that I could ask. They have done more for me than many parents do for their own children. There has been some dispute in regard to my age and nationality, and could you tell me where I was born? Although these are small things, yet I would like to know if you could tell me. If you could spare the time to answer, I would be very grateful to you. Most sincerely, Jessie D. Langworthy." Both girls flourished in the Langworthy home and took the name as their own. Jessie learned to play the piano, studied elocution, and taught school. Both girls married and lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. Carmen became a specialist in judging and raising fancy poultry and in domestic affairs. Sadly, Carmen developed the influenza of 1918 after her marriage to a soldier from nearby Camp Custer and died young. Angelina, Filomena, and Marie Del Vecchio were born in Naples, Italy. After immigrating, their mother passed away, but their father was working as a day laborer. They had been placed first in Paris, Missouri in 1905. H.D. Clark took them from Paris, Missouri in 1907 to multiple homes in Iowa. Clark reports, Angelina, or Anna, was born in 1894 and placed in Murray, Iowa, first on a farm that mistreated her and worked her, quote, fearfully hard. Clark stated that he had a time in removing her to Corning, near her sister Marie. She was averse to restraint, but got along without trouble. She eventually married unhappily, and the husband later died. She remarried to a Mr. Calvin Wilcox and lived in Blanchard, Iowa as of 1927. She had had 4 children from both marriages. Clark wrote of Filomena, or Phila, that she was born in 1896 and went to Denton, Montana with her folks. She was bright, active, and happy-go-lucky. She married Frake Rowbotham and lived in Arlington, South Dakota as of 1927. The husband was a, quote, spendthrift and not kind to Phila. She had 3 boys and 2 girls. Marie was born in 1892, and in 1907, Clark placed her with the Houch family north of Corning, Iowa, on a farm. Clark had once visited her when she was in the hospital in Cresco, Iowa, when she was very sick. But in 1927, she was in De Smet, South Dakota, working, unmarried, and in the best of health. Stephen Avokna was placed out alongside Charles William and J.A. Wayne in Holton, Kansas. He was placed with the Matson family, Jacob and Eliza, who ran a livery stable. When Jacob passed in 1910, his obituary stated that he and his wife had adopted and raised 6 children. Stephen was the youngest. Stephen was still with the Matson family in 1900 at 21. He had taken on the name Matson and Americanized the spelling of his first name. Through his father's obituary, we know that Stephen passed before his father between 1900 and 1910. H.D. Clark began working in Cincinnati as a placing agent after being recommended to the organization by the Children's Aid Society of New York in 1911. He would place children in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and once in Alabama. In his writing during this time, Clark says, quote, "After 14 years of experience in placing and visiting children in their homes, I am convinced that the visitor or agent should spend more time with foster parents in tactfully discussing the great problems of childhood and child raising. There are so many excellent families that have little tact in adapting themselves to different dispositions of children. They seem to consider the orphan child from the city as different in inheritance and blood from other children. They give up too easily the task of improving a hasty temper or careless habit sometimes found in the adoptive child. Human blood is of the same color," said Abraham Lincoln, "and the disposition and tendencies of our wards are the same as of other children, and they are susceptible to the same laws of love and kindness." Clark went on to place out many children, including children of color, from the Cincinnati Placing Out program, including Daniel Hatfield. Being that he was so young, it is likely that his name changed, and we are still looking for his records. Thelma Taylor was born between 1904 and 1905. Thelma was 7 years old when Agent Clark placed her with a, quote, well-to-do black family in Salina, Ohio, unquote. Sadly, Clark reports, quote, "Other members of the family, jealous, abused the child. She had to be removed the next year," unquote. It is unknown what happened to her after she returned to Cincinnati. Thelma was one of the first Orphan Train Riders honored by an Orphan Train statue in Concordia, the Orphan Train town. Samuel Hayes was also placed out by H.D. Clark in Ohio. Of the placement, Agent Clark wrote, quote, "Samuel Hayes was a colored boy. He was 11 years of age. I took him from the House of Refuge. His father was still living and worked in a cotton factory. The mother was dead. He had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. I took him to a colored family at St. Henry named O'Kay. The man was a minister in the AME church. He was not at home. His wife and son looked after the farm. The wife and son were home, and we arrived at dinner time. She and the boy looked Samuel over as you would a pig you were about to buy, or as whites used to look over a slave to buy," unquote. Soon Mrs. O'Kay said, "I don't want him." "Why?" asked Clark. "He's too black and his hair is too curly," she replied. "But I described him to you, and you wrote and told me to bring him," he said. "But I don't want him," she insisted. Clark said, "I might have brought you an Indian with straight hair." She said, "I'd have taken him." Clark replied, "You better go south where white folks are not as prejudiced as you are." Clark stated, quote, "We were not invited to dinner. They were serving chicken. And so I drove 5 miles to the nearest hotel, bought the boy a good dinner like he had never had before, and then drove him back to Cincinnati," unquote. Like Thelma, we have been unable to find out more information on Samuel, but we're still looking. While Orphan Train Riders are often difficult to trace, riders of color are even harder to trace. We found that riders of color were more likely to be placed out older, as preteens and teenagers. They also are more likely to be taken in to work and less likely to be treated as members of the family. While we find this happens to older children of all colors placed out, the age range differs. White riders are often placed as apprentices or to work as teens and young adults, as they were expected to be sent to school until they were 16. Overall, children of color were less likely to be placed out. This could be because the orphanages placing organizations were working with were segregated. Inherent racism and prejudice play a large role, and orphanages for children of color serve the dual role of education. Many children were placed in an institution simply to receive the education they were being denied by society. Their parents and other family members could have maintained guardianship, and thus they were not eligible to be placed out. The same prejudices we see today happened during the Orphan Train movement. Homes of people of color, immigrants, and those living in poverty were heavily scrutinized and over-policed by welfare organizations. During our research, one of the wonderful things we learned about was the Sankofa bird. The Sankofa is a metaphorical symbol used by the Akan people of Ghana, generally depicted as a bird with its head turned backward, taking an egg from its back. It expresses the importance of reaching back to knowledge gained in the past and bringing it into the present in order to make positive progress. Simply put, by Reverend Kimberly Dethridge of the AME Church, sometimes we need to go back to our past to move towards our future. We find that our orphan train descendants connect with this message, because while all history is not meant to be celebrated, all history is meant to be remembered.